The following program is sponsored in part by To a Woman's Heart. The thoughts and views expressed by the following production don't necessarily reflect those of the network or any sponsors. Rainbow Room Publishing Live starting in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
It was called the Great Migration. The degradation, discrimination, and agricultural servitude of their lives in the American South spurred African Americans to search for better opportunities in the northern states. They went by the thousands. While some of these migrants landed in bustling cities like Chicago and Detroit, a great many of them found a home in Harlem, New York. And while most settled into a slightly improved life, they also brought something that changed the landscape and demographics of the previously white-dominated part of the metropolis: art. Art that would serve as a catalyst for a cultural explosion. From cool jazz that redefined American music, to provocative sculptures and paintings, to soulful film, literature, and poetry deeper than the Hudson River. And all of it speaking to African American life and experiences. Originally known as the New Negro Movement, this profound moment in history would not only redefine the perception of American blacks, it would shape their own identity. For there was to be a renaissance in Harlem. As we continue to educate ourselves on Black history in America, we urge you to join us in supporting highly important institutions, such as this week's organization, the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, which for 95 years has preserved, protected, and fostered a greater understanding of the Black experience through its collections, programs, and scholarships. You can learn more and donate via the link in the description below. In order for any renaissance to come about, you need a specific set of ingredients. The first one is pretty self-explanatory. You need artists. And thanks to the aforementioned migration, Black artists came to Harlem in droves. Though it should be noted that many from the Afro-Caribbean community also took their chances in making their way to this city, looking for better prospects and patrons. The second ingredient is a guiding force to channel and direct all this creative energy. And that was especially crucial with this particular movement, since it was seen by Black intellectuals as a way to smash stereotypes and do away with the image of the African American as only good for manual labor and menial work. The man who stepped in to fill that role was scholar and civil rights activist W.E.B. Du Bois, who at that time served as the editor of the NAACP monthly magazine, The Crisis. Du Bois resolved to use the publication as a staging point for the movement, an idea he articulated by publishing a sort of manifesto on Black theater. It was expected to be, as he said, about us, by us, for us, and near us. He also founded the organization CRIGWA, a loose acronym for Crisis Guild of Writers and Artists, and sponsored a playwriting contest for scripts about the Black experience. The hope was to broaden the types of stories told about African Americans on the stage, since that was one of the few types of mass entertainment where Black people could control their own narratives. You do not have to confine your writings to the portrayal of beggars, scoundrels, and prostitutes. The contest rules instructed. You can write about ordinary, decent colored people if you want.
Last year, with this simple strategy, we spent $320,000. I generated $1.8 million in revenue as a result.
As a result of this prodding from civil rights leaders and theater critics, a host of plays produced at this time included a complex reflection of real African American life. In fact, as time went on, not only did more all-Black theater companies form, but they even began overshadowing New York's mainstream white playwrights. Seeing this success, other literary organizations sponsored their own prizes for fiction and poetry. Zora Neale Hurston got her break, winning the Opportunity Literary Journal Contest, and eventually became a staple of the movement. And poet Langston Hughes was first published and promoted in Du Bois' The Crisis. Both breathtakingly prolific writers who produced crucial works, Hurston and Hughes would be included in the New Negro Movement anthology, curated by the country's first Black Rhodes Scholar, Alain Locke. Other influencers in the scene were quite different, such as William Elmer Harmon, a wealthy white real estate developer who created the Harmon Foundation in 1922. Originally, the foundation focused on building playgrounds and creating nursing programs to assist lesser-served neighborhoods across the country. But it would soon be known for providing a platform for Black painters and sculptors to showcase their unseen works. While at the time, many whites fraternizing with Blacks were suspected of trying to recruit African Americans to the socialist cause, Harmon was clearly a stone-cold capitalist. While not a champion for equality, Harmon knew that helping African Americans make economic gains was better for the country as a whole. So his foundation set up local exhibits and national tours and established the Harmon Award for Distinguished Achievement Among Negroes. Winners in the 8 categories, which included both music and fine arts, received a medal and $400. While the Harmon Foundation threw its support behind raw talent, prominent individuals like Du Bois and Locke believed that Black Americans should create African-influenced art as a way to uplift the race. Locke, noting that European superstars like Picasso and Matisse were themselves delving into African-influenced imagery, firmly believed that art from Black people should look different than that of whites. It was a concept that met with some controversy in the movement. Painters like William Edward Scott beautifully captured African American and Haitian subjects, but were considered too conservative and traditionally European in form. And while Scott would go on to win a Harmon Award and etch out a career in Paris, his work was often passed over by Locke and other influential thinkers. And this debate over the aesthetic and long-term goals of Black artistry would take on different forms within the arenas of cinema and music. Oscar Micheaux, regarded as the most successful Black director and independent movie producer of the first half of the 20th century, told the exact stories that the Black elites of the Renaissance were looking for. With some of his movies set in the Black Mecca of Harlem, his 44 films met both critical and commercial success. His characters were not the shucksters and mammies found in white-dominated films, and there were no white actors in blackface. They stood tall, spoke clearly, and had poise, dignity, and agency in films like Within Our Gates and Murder in Harlem. Plus, he didn't shy away from social commentary or tackling complex issues like passing for white or lynching, with his work providing a rebuttal to the critically acclaimed yet abhorrently racist film The Birth of a Nation, which glorified the Ku Klux Klan. But while Black elites embraced Micheaux, there was still some trepidation in regards to jazz and the blues, much of which had been brought up from the South. In the long run, however, the music proved too infectious to fight, and jazz and the big band sound permeated the consciousness of Harlem, then the entire country. And with that came the much-needed third ingredient for the Harlem Renaissance: patrons. As word of Harlem's nightlife spread, it enticed many whites to come out in droves and see a show or two. And not just in the well-heeled spots like the legendary Cotton Club that catered to white clientele. The smaller nightclubs and cabarets also found themselves packed. Excited whites would socialize, dance, and drink in the same establishments as Black patrons and performers till all hours of the night, which at this time was still illegal in other parts of the country. But by becoming the ultimate purveyors of cool, musicians like Duke Ellington, Cab Calloway, and Louis Armstrong, and phenomenal singers like Bessie Smith and Lena Horne, Harlem managed to create an oasis free from some of those restrictive social norms. Yet despite the many positive things that came out of the Renaissance, some historians remain critical of the movement, accusing Du Bois, Locke, and members of the Black bourgeoisie of manufacturing the Renaissance in order to use African-American art as a propaganda tool. They also point out that while many of the Harmon exhibits did bring in crowds, the sales that were supposed to provide a better life for many of their award-winning painters and sculptors never materialized. In fact, many of them were forced to move to Europe or retreat back to their unfulfilling day jobs. Like many artists, they wouldn't be celebrated until they were dead. But though that may be accurate, it's also true that many perceptions, stereotypes, and false narratives about African Americans were debunked during this extraordinary time period. And before the Great Depression put an end to this eruption of Black culture, the people of Harlem knew that they hadn't just migrated and settled a city to solely escape Jim Crow. Despite the struggles, hardships, and everything stacked against them by society, they found their artistic voice and made their dreams come true, and had, if only for a while, become all they knew they could be. Now we know that we've only scratched the surface of the Harlem Renaissance with this episode, but we do hope it serves as an inspiration for you to seek out and learn more about these and other amazing artists of the movement. Because while much of their work influenced the American theater, literature, music, and film we all enjoy today, the stories of their lives during this extraordinary time can also serve as an inspiration for new generations of artists to share their own voices. See you next time, everyone. Legendary patron roll call: Ahmed Ziad Turk, Alicia Bramble, Casey Mustia, Dominic Valenciana, Gunnar Clovis, Kyle Murgatroyd, and O'Reels1. Thank you so much.
If you're interested in Black history or American history, the Harlem Renaissance is an important event. To proclaim its story, one must foremost begin with the Great Migration. After the Civil War, African Americans started exiting the South in diminutive numbers. The escalation in the pace of African Americans departing from the South marks the beginning of the Great Migration. The Great Migration transpired from 1910 to 1970 and incorporated two spans. The first Great Migration ensued from 1910 to 1930, and the second Great Migration from 1940 to 1970. It was the first Great Migration that ushered in the Harlem Renaissance. Historians attributed the transition in population to push-pull factors. Elements that compelled Black folks to desert the South were Jim Crow laws, terrorist attacks by white supremacists, and the boll weevil. Factors that lured African Americans to the North were labor opportunities of the First World War and the termination of immigration into the United States. African Americans relocated to the prominent municipalities of the Northeast and the Midwest. In 1910, New York's African American inhabitants expanded from 140,000 to 650,000 by 1940. Initially,
this AI tool will create a stunning ebook direct from your content, whether it's a Microsoft Word document or a Google.
Harlem was a white community in uptown Manhattan. African Americans began to arrive inhabiting low-rent apartments and affordable rooms. Over time, the transformation became pronounced in the community. This conversion in the population caught the attention of Philip Payton Jr., an aspiring African-American entrepreneur. Payton Jr. worked for his family barbering business while his two brothers attended Yale University. He wanted to attend the university like his brothers, but he couldn't afford to. Payton endeavored several jobs before landing a janitorial position at a real estate firm. His job at the firm opened the door for property management prospects. His first newspaper advertisement read, quote, "Colored man makes specialty of managing colored tenants." The increase of African Americans in the area encountered resistance. In 1905, the New York Herald ran the headline announcing, quote, "Negroes move into Harlem," end quote. The story read, "An untoward circumstance has been injected into the private dwelling market in the vicinity of 133rd and 134th Streets. During the last 3 years, flats that were occupied entirely by white folks have been captured for occupation by a Negro population. 133rd still shows some signs of resistance to the blending of colors in the streets, but between Lenox and 7th Avenues has practically succumbed to the ingress of colored tenants. Real estate brokers predict that it's only a matter of time before the entire block will be a stronghold for the Negro population." Payton Jr. recognized this trend and acted upon it. On June 15, 1904, he chartered the African American Realty Company. The first offering for investors was 50,000 shares at $10 each. The investment proposition enticed small Black investors interested in making yields and assembling a base for African American empowerment. He advertised directly to Black investors, telling them, quote, "Now is the time to buy. If you want to be numbered among those of the race who are doing something towards solving the so-called race problem." In 1905, the white-owned Hudson Realty Company bought land on West 135th Street near Lenox Avenue. The land Hudson purchased was in the heart of Harlem, and plans were to build residential housing. Hudson also purchased 3 adjacent tenement buildings from Afro-American Realty. After the acquisition, Hudson evicted all the Black inhabitants and substituted them with whites. The Afro-American Realty Company responded by attaining 2 neighboring apartment houses, evicting their white renters, and replacing them with Blacks expelled by Hudson. These dysfunctional incidents triggered a decline in property value, and ultimately, Hudson Company sold its initial acquisitions back to Afro-American Realty at a considerable loss. This shrewd business maneuvering against Hudson enhanced Peyton Jr.'s prestige and seduced more investors in Afro-American Realty Company. The Afro-American Realty Company continued to obtain houses, tenements, and apartment buildings in and around Harlem. African Americans from neighboring areas began to migrate to Harlem, and before the 1910 Great Migration, Harlem was clearly majority Black. Migration into New York did not just come from African Americans in the South. Blacks migrated from Jamaica, Haiti, Puerto Rico, and the Dominican. The most well-known Caribbean immigrant from this period was Marcus Garvey. Garvey infused a sense of militant Black nationalism into academic and creative cultural developments. In Emancipated from Mental Slavery, Select Sayings of Marcus Garvey, he says, quote, "Look for me in the whirlwind or the storm. Look for me all around you, for, with God's grace, I shall come and bring with me countless millions of Black slaves who have died in America and the West Indies and the millions in Africa to aid you in the fight for liberty, freedom, and life," end quote. The merger of Black political ideas, literary, and artistic expression fused and became what we now call the Harlem Renaissance. The struggle from slavery to emancipation began with the 13th Amendment, adopted on December 18th, 1865, abolishing slavery and enforced servitude. On July 9th, 1868, the ratification of the 14th Amendment guaranteed citizenship and equal protection under the law. These two amendments were to be strengthened by three bills known as the Enforcement Acts. The Enforcement Acts specifically safeguarded African Americans' right to vote, hold office, serve on juries, and be guaranteed equal protection under the law. In addition, the Enforcement Acts permitted the federal government to intercede when states did not defend these rights. The purpose of the Enforcement Acts was to improve the conditions for African Americans during Reconstruction by neutralizing the Ku Klux Klan and other terrorist organizations that arose after the emancipation of African Americans. The Enforcement Acts prohibited terrorist acts committed to intimidate African Americans from embracing freedom and admission to suffrage rights. The new federal laws and constitutional amendments became only words on paper due to a lack of will to enforce them. White supremacist redeemers took control of legislators in the South and began implementing Black codes, also known as Jim Crow laws. Proponents of these laws touted them as sensible and donned the phrase separate but equal regarding the status of Blacks. The Black codes implemented in each state became fortified in 1883 when the Supreme Court struck down the Civil Rights Act. The Supreme Court's justification for striking down the Civil Rights Act was that it did not address civil rights, but rather social. The court cited the 14th Amendment protected a person's civil rights from violation by the state and not by the efforts of individuals. The Supreme Court's decision to strike down the Civil Rights Act set the stage for state legislators to enact lawmaking that legalized segregation in public places. The Supreme Court upheld the law in 1896 with the decision of the Plessy versus Ferguson case. The decision established the notorious Declaration of Separate but Equal, concluding that segregation did not violate the Equal Protection Clause in the 14th Amendment so long as facilities were similar. The Supreme Court established separation, but equality was not a part of the equation. Facilities made for African Americans were inferior, underfunded, and unmanaged, in effect, reestablishing institutionalized racism and discrimination. Racism in the North enjoyed taking the form of housing segregation, banking lending practices, and job discrimination. With the United States military already segregated, General Albert Burleson established plans to segregate the railway mail service. President Woodrow Wilson introduced federal workplace segregation in 1913, which echoed many procedures established in the South.
This is how to get in shape fast.
If you want to drop this, start eating more of these. You might think this would take years to learn, but I'm going to teach it to you in 60 seconds. Watch this.
William Edward Burghardt Du Bois was born in 1868 in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. His father, Alfred, deserted the family, leaving his mother to sustain the family as a domestic servant. Du Bois excelled in public school and attended the historical Black Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. At Fisk University, Du Bois obtained his education and firsthand experience with life in the Jim Crow South. After attending Fisk, Du Bois went to Harvard and graduated in 1895 with a doctorate in history. His PhD dissertation, The Suppression of the African Slave Trade to the United States of America, was published as a book, becoming his first in dozens he would later write. After attending Harvard, Du Bois studied sociology at the University of Berlin for the next few years. He believed each race possessed its unique gift and should contribute its gift to a global, individual, and collective kingdom of culture. When Du Bois returned to the United States, he quickly realized options for pursuing a career in academia were limited. Du Bois eventually found an opportunity at Atlanta University, where he finished his literary classic, The Souls of Black Folks. The Souls of Black Folks was a collection of essays, snippets of autobiography, and fiction intended to shine a light on the reality of those who lived, quote, within the veil, end quote. The intended audience was supposed to be white, but Du Bois' book had a more significant influence on Blacks. This influence became especially felt by the artists, poets, and writers who created the backbone of the Harlem Renaissance. Du Bois knew exactly where he stood in the emerging Black movement. His position in the African American struggle was clear when contrasted against the views of Booker T. Washington. In the beginning, Du Bois' disagreements with Washington's work and sentiments were respectful, but eventually, he increasingly became harsh towards him. Booker Taliaferro Washington was born an enslaved person on April 5th, 1856, in Halesford, Virginia. Washington entered the domain of education and founded the Tuskegee Institute. Washington established the Tuskegee Institute with the vision of what a population emerging from generations of slavery required to integrate into society. His position on the African American struggle was for incremental entry, emphasizing educational development and political representation. He urged Blacks to accept discrimination briefly, concentrate on personal growth, and prove their work through hard work and material prosperity. Du Bois disagreed with this position, stating that it gave a passive acceptance of Jim Crow racism. Du Bois and other like-minded Black intellectuals started the Niagara movement in opposition to Booker T. Washington's passive strategy. The Niagara movement promoted rapid changes in opposition to racial segregation and disenfranchisement. The Niagara movement did not gain much support, but its creation indicates a desire of some African Americans to take a stronger stance against codified white supremacy. In 1910, Du Bois moved to New York, where he began working for the NAACP and edited its monthly journal, The Crisis. Du Bois could not accomplish much with the predominantly white leadership of the NAACP, but he became famous through the mainly Black readership of The Crisis. His views on lynching, World War I, Bolshevism, Pan-Africanism, Garveyism, and the New Deal became talking points. Du Bois positioned himself as the torchbearer of the new literary and artistic movement during the Harlem Renaissance. He recognized that artistic and literary expression would prove Black legitimacy far better than Blacks accepting discrimination and pursuing an education. Du Bois argued that the Black man was the original American artist, and the rude melodies of Black slaves were the only authentic American music. Du Bois stated that Black laughter, dance, and music gave substance to an otherwise empty, materialistic American culture. Through the crisis, Du Bois launched a competition for Black writers. It was through this competition that Langston Hughes materialized with his poem, The Negro Speaks Rivers. Du Bois was ultimately guilty of intellectual and artistic snobbery. He could not embrace Louis Armstrong or Billie Holiday over Wagner and Beethoven. He couldn't embrace Langston Hughes and Claude McKay over Byron and Tennyson. The inability to embrace African Americans over whites contradicted the very movement he was instrumental in creating. Du Bois' appeal to classical music and his declarations for Blacks to compete and not simply mimic estranged him from the movement where he existed on its fringes. Booker T. Washington lectured patience and incremental growth, and Du Bois pushed the status quo, demanding full equality. But Marcus Garvey personified Black vigor and political assertiveness. Marcus Garvey is the founder of Black Pride and modern Black nationalism. African Americans needed a charismatic leader who could uplift them and provide assertive direction, and Garvey provided just that. Marcus Garvey was born August the 17th, 1887, in St. Ann's Bay, Jamaica. He was a printer by trade and the publisher of several small newspapers. Garvey was a gifted public speaker who gained a political education on the sugar plantations of Jamaica. In 1910, he left Jamaica and traveled through Central and South America. Garvey's beliefs developed with the influence of Du Bois' ideas of Pan-Africanism and Booker T. Washington's pragmatic views. He synthesized their ideas with the vision of where to go and expectations for African Americans to aspire beyond plantations and colonial power. In 1912, he traveled to Europe and took classes in law and philosophy at the University of London. Garvey also contributed to the African Times and Oriental Review, published by Duce Muhammad Ali. Duce Muhammad Ali was an Egyptian Sudanese intellectual known for his radical positions on African nationalism. His influence was significant among a generation of politically conscious Black diasporans. Ali was very influential to Garvey, who often spoke at Hyde Park's Speaker's Corner. When Garvey returned to Jamaica, he adopted the ideology of Booker T. Washington. He preached accommodating colonial rule and taking a one-step-at-a-time approach to Black advancement. On Garvey's first visit to the United States in 1916, he quickly changed his mind about that position. The new Negro era was in full swing, and Booker T. Washington passed away just shortly ago. Traveling to Tuskegee became somewhat of a pilgrimage, and along the way, Garvey encountered racism like nothing he had ever experienced. Garvey learned that the United States was a hotbed of racial politics beyond his experiences. The experience in the United States altered his vision and style of activism. In 1917, the city of East St. Louis became the scene of a race riot. An influx of African American workers into traditional white industries provoked tensions that led to a violent anti-Black massacre supported by law enforcement. This event impacted Garvey, and as a response, he founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association. He gave a lengthy speech on July 8, 1917 at Lafayette Hall proclaiming, quote, "The East St. Louis riot, or rather massacre, will go down in history as one of the bloodiest of outrages against mankind for which any class of people could be held guilty. This is no time for fine words, but a time to lift one's voice against the savagery of a people who claim to be the dispenser of democracy." Marcus Garvey emerged as one of the most influential Black leaders of the generation. He was an electric speaker whose ideas on African American economic and cultural independence became known as Garveyism. One can describe Garveyism as the liberation of Africa from colonial rule and the spiritual rescue of the Black race. Garvey viewed Africa as a fallen society removed from the earlier days of greatness. He believed the Black race was the only one capable of restoring Africa to greatness and global respect. At the start of the 1920s, many young Blacks arrived from Africa to the United States to obtain higher education. The influx was due to financial support from independent churches that began to spring up across the African continent. This movement became known as Ethiopianism. Edified by Psalm 68:31, Ethiopia stretched forth its hands unto God. The independent churches in Africa interpreted this phrase to imply a direct contact between the Black race and God for the sacred objective of emancipation. Traditional white-dominated churches, which pioneered colonialism on the African continent, were seen as impeding or even harming Black progress. Independent churches utilized the fundamental parts of Christianity, but injected it with Black standards while using it to organize politically. The earliest transatlantic ecumenical partnership and the first independent Black church in the United States was the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Garvey did not work from within the church, but his campaign was about Black redemption. Garvey's vision for Black redemption, alongside Du Bois' Pan-Africanism, synthesized and exploded across the consciousness of the Black diaspora. The machine of Garveyism was the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Its headquarters in Harlem enclosed a 6-block radius from 135th Street and Lenox Avenue. The area contained the movement's spiritual center, Liberty Hall, alongside UNIA-affiliated businesses. The most popular UNIA-affiliated company was the Black Star Line. It intended to spread Black business and people across the globe and ultimately facilitate the return of American Blacks to Africa en masse. This event became known as the Back to Africa movement. The Black Star Line operated for 3 years between 1919 and 1922. The shipping company did not become a financial success, but it became a cultural one. The grassroots adored Marcus Garvey, but Black intellectuals like Du Bois saw Garvey as an embarrassment. People would see Garvey parading around in the uniform and hat of an imperial ruler. Du Bois described Garvey as, quote, "without doubt the most dangerous enemy of the Negro race in America and in the world. He is either a lunatic or a traitor," end quote. His main objection to Garvey was his position that no Black American could ever obtain citizenship, so the separation of all Blacks back to Africa was the only solution to the Negro problem. Garvey accused Du Bois of bias based on his lighter skin and academic experience. Du Bois referred to Garvey as an ugly, fat Black man, and Garvey called Du Bois a white man's nigger. Garvey was deported back to Jamaica in 1927. Ironically, Du Bois himself forfeited his American citizenship
Enemy submarine spotted.
And moved to Ghana. The Harlem Renaissance was not only a conscious movement, but it was an artistic one as well. It established a new Black cultural uniqueness and signaled an arrival of a new age for African Americans. Du Bois saw Black achievement as equal to white achievements and once stated, quote, "It is unfair to judge us by our criminals and prostitutes." In Du Bois' mind, if Blacks could rival whites in cultural achievement, then Blacks would have a fair assertion of equality. Some African Americans embraced this philosophy and made sure their art reflected it. Artists like Aaron Douglas had a separate view of what Black art should be about. Aaron Douglas was born May 26, 1899 in Topeka, Kansas. In 1925, Douglas ended up in Harlem by chance while en route to Paris to attend the university. What he witnessed in Harlem encouraged him to stay. His first work was to illustrate Alain Locke's book, The New Negro. Shortly after, Douglas acquired additional work from writers like Langston Hughes, Charles S. Johnson, Countee Cullen, Claude McKay, Wallace Thurman, and James Weldon Johnson. His work incorporated Art Deco with modernist forms and stylized geometric patterns and shapes of African art. Douglas based himself in Harlem, but most of the notable Black artists of his time lived in Paris. In Paris, an occurrence similar to the Harlem Renaissance called the Paris Noir, or the Black Paris, was happening. Black artists found a far greater appreciation for their arts in Paris. Audiences in France understood Black art, and Black artists from the United States found Paris appealing. The seeds for appreciation of Black art in France began with the early ragtime artists. The freedom and appreciation Blacks experienced in Paris inspired the innovation of art with a greater degree of sophistication. Black artists thrived in Paris until the Great Depression forced many Blacks back to America. The return of Black artists from Paris is why the finest work in visual arts from the Harlem Renaissance materialized in the 1930s. The relocation may have been undesired by the artists that returned, but the art that they brought back to America inspired the work of local New York artists. One such artist was Palmer Hayden. Palmer C. Hayden was born on January 15, 1890 in Widewater, Virginia. He used oils and watercolors to depict African American social landscapes. He attended Cooper Union in New York and Booth Bay Art Colony in Maine. In 1925, he created his first masterwork, Fétiche et Fleurs. Another artist was Archibald Motley. Archibald John Motley Jr. was born October 7, 1891, in New Orleans, Louisiana. He became characterized as a Jazz Age modernist. Motley's art captured the dynamic scenes of Black life during this period. He attended the Art Institute of Chicago and was instrumental in a similar art movement occurring in Chicago. Hayden and Motley were artists who stayed true to expressing the Black experience in their work. Sergeant Claude Johnson was another impactful artist of the Harlem Renaissance. Johnson's creations echoed African forms, and he arguably was one of the best artists from the Harlem Renaissance. His work encompassed sculptures, carvings, masks, murals, and paintings, and used different African styles simultaneously. The finest sculptor of the era was Augusta Savage. Savage was a traveled academic advocate whose work became influenced by both Africa and America. She produced bronze busts of prominent African American leaders. Savage received a scholarship to study in France, but had it rescinded due to jealous white students who received the same scholarship. Her stunted academic pursuits inspired her to advocate for the development of young Black artists. She is one of the longest living artists from that era and a key figure in the civil rights movement. Her well-known bust of the Harlem Child Gammon made her famous. Another artist was Meadavow Warwick Fuller. Fuller was a poet, sculptor, and a painter. Her work was distinctly Afrocentric with a classical European influence. One of her peers considered her the most imaginative Black artist of her generation. Fuller and Savage are the first significant African American female sculptors. Fuller's work embodied the new pro-Black identity emerging from the Harlem Renaissance. The amount of literature produced during the Harlem Renaissance is staggering. Literature came in several forms, from poetry, drama, periodicals, journals, and news reporting. March 21st, 1924, a significant event occurred in Black literature. Organized by Charles S. Johnson, editor of Opportunity, a journal of Negro life, the event celebrated the publication of Jesse Fawcett's There Is Confusion. There Is Confusion was significant due to its new portrayals of African Americans in literature. The venue chosen for the event was the Civic Club, about 100 blocks south of Harlem. Johnson asked Alain Locke to preside over the event. Locke agreed to preside over the event as long as it expanded to include all African American writers instead of Fawcett by herself. Alain Locke was another key Harlem Renaissance artist. Born on September 13, 1885 in Philadelphia, Locke was a literary forefather. Alain Locke became the first Black man to obtain a Rhodes Scholarship, and his academic career included places like Harvard and Oxford University. His most influential work was The New Negro, published in 1925. The title of his work provided the name and the vision of the revitalized Black future. Alain was gay, and he was an advocate for young gay African Americans. Alain hosted the Civic Club dinner, which ended up being a spectacular gala occasion with over 100 guests from Du Bois to James Weldon Johnson. The dinner coalesced African American writers and intellectuals together, accelerating the scholarly aspect of the Harlem Renaissance. In 1921, the famous 63rd Street Music Hall hosted a musical called Shuffle Along, written by comedians Flournoy Miller and Aubrey Lyles. The score was composed and sung by Eubie Blake and Noble Sissle. The performers included Josephine Baker and Paul Robeson, who would later become superstars. The first performance of Shuffle Along was so influential, it defined the nature and essence of nightlife during the Harlem Renaissance. It introduced Black music and theater to white audiences who became fascinated. It introduced jazz to Broadway, along with excitingly new, finely choreographed jazz routines. Before long, many Black written shows appeared on Broadway. Eventually, white writers began to produce their versions of Black musical comedies. Shuffle Along also assisted in the development of jazz and the blues. Harlem did not create jazz. It came from the Blacks who moved from places like New Orleans, Memphis, and St. Louis because of the Great Migration. Author James Weldon Johnson said, "Jazz came to Harlem around 1905 with the Memphis Students. They played at Proctor's 23rd Street Theater. One of the Memphis student members, James Reese Europe, became a well-known composer. Europe performed at the Clef Club Orchestra at Carnegie Hall. Jazz clubs started to manifest everywhere in Harlem. These places became legendary, like the Alhambra Ballroom, the Apollo Theater, Club Harlem, Lenox Lounge, Showman's Jazz Club, and Minton's Playhouse. Many greats like Ella Fitzgerald, Louis Armstrong, Count Basie, Billie Holiday, and Cab Calloway would perform at these venues and go on as international superstars.
5 minutes ago, she'd never play piano.
During the height of the French Empire in the late 20th century, Paris became the hub of Black cultural understanding and revitalization. Blacks within the French colonies attempted to solidify and secure their culture against the French, who were trying to replace it. The development of Black society in the African colonies improved rapidly due to missionary-sponsored primary education. The educated class began to take control of the developing colonial military, police, industry, and administration. These Blacks became the first generation of Blacks who obtained their education from universities overseas. Educated Blacks transformed societies in Africa and the Caribbean. A new generation of young Black leaders, knowledgeable in Western politics and society, sought to embrace the modern world while synthesizing it with their own culture. This new philosophy became referred to as negritude. Its greatest advocate was Léopold Senghor, a Senegalese scholar and poet. Senegal was France's primary territory in Africa and the origin of the assimilation movement. Assimilation was a movement to turn the Black elite of the colonies into Black Frenchmen. French institutions became open to direct utilization from people within the colonies. When France gained control over most of the West and equatorial African continent, assimilating 60 million Africans became unpractical. The influx of Black intellectuals, artists, and aspiring leaders into Paris created a vibrant Black social and academic scene. Senghor came to Paris in 1928 at the age of 22. Senghor attended Sorbonne and the University of Paris, where he received the aggregation in French grammar. He later worked as a professor at the universities of Tours and Paris, teaching from 1935 to 1945. After World War II, he became dean of the linguistics department with the École nationale de la France des Outre-mer until 1960. In 1960, Senghor led Senegal to independence. Léopold Senghor was not the sole founder of negritude. Another founder, M. Césaire, was an intellectual and a poet. Césaire was fiercely loyal to his African roots and hostile to the French colonization of his homeland. Léon Damas was another founder. Damas was a poet and an intellectual who later became politically active in his homeland of French Guiana. The three men met in Paris, and around them were other similar-minded people from the French colonial diaspora. Two integral similar-minded thinkers were the Nardal sisters, Paulette and Jean. The Nardal sisters were socialites who provided a tremendous contribution to the movement. The Nardal sisters were born into an upper-middle-class family that was able to facilitate their education in Paris. Paulette was the first Black person to attend Sorbonne. Her sister Jean followed behind. Historians credit them for facilitating the movement through their salon, the Clermont Salon. Le Clermont Salon was a tea shop popular with Black scholars and a meeting ground where intellectuals discussed negritude. The Nardal sisters refined the fundamental philosophies of negritude and helped establish the movement. Paulette Nardal translated many of the works of the Harlem Renaissance writers into French. The translations assisted in developing a common identity and bridging the Harlem Renaissance with the movement in Paris. In October 1931, the sisters founded La Revue du Monde Noir, Review of the Black World, a journal that became influential in conveying the Pan-African ideals of negritude. Black military men during World War I were the first to notice artistic and social freedom in Paris. Paris hosted a significant Black population going back to the sale of Louisiana and the many Blacks who left North America to escape the threat of slavery. It was a setting comparatively free of racism that enticed many to stay. The Americans who stayed in Paris brought jazz with them and gave birth to the Paris Noir. African American artists and writers found Paris to be invigoratingly free of racism. Montmartre became the center of a community of African American jazz clubs like Le Grand Duc and Chez Florence. The person credited for bringing the jazz revolution to Paris is Lieutenant James R. Europe. The Senegalese TIR, already in large numbers in France, made it easy to receive Black troops into Paris during World War I. French accepted they owed the Blacks from the colonies, and their perspective towards Black existence in France was more receptive than in America. James Reese Europe was born in Mobile, Alabama in 1880. His family became a part of the Great Migration and moved to Washington, D.C. in 1890. He followed his older brother to New York and worked as a composer and a conductor, contributing to several theatrical productions. He became a founding member of the Clef Club. The Clef Club was a musician's hangout, labor exchange, and a concert venue. The Clef Club Orchestra became the first African-American orchestra in America. The orchestra included 125 members playing a variety of instruments. In 1913, Europe became a musical director for the ballroom dancers Vernon and Irene Castle. Europe assisted the Castles in developing dance routines with syncopation. Europe and the Castles appeared in venues not traditionally familiar to Black performers, fueling the growth of dance hall and nightlife style. Europe and his association with the Castles contributed to the breaking down of prejudices against Black music. Europe's arrangement of the Memphis Blues is said to have led to the creation of the foxtrot. As the United States approached its entrance into World War I, the 15th National Guard Regiment, made of all Black troops, was formed in Harlem. Europe was commissioned as a lieutenant in order to organize a regiment band. The 15th National Guard Regiment was a labor force until its reestablishment as the 369th U.S. Army Regiment. The 369th was attached to the French Army and became known as the Harlem Hellfighters, or the Black Rattlers. The 369th's combat efforts earned the respect of their French peers. What gained an even greater respect was their marching band, which boosted morale and became arguably the most famous band in Europe. On February 9th, 1919, the 369th returned home to New York. The band recorded 24 instrumental and 6 vocal ensemble sides for the French record company Pathé. James Europe was tragically killed in a knife attack by one of his drummers after an argument. He died at the age of 39 and became the first African American to have a public funeral in New York City. Europe's influence lived on through band members who stayed behind in France. These band members organized and began to perform in Paris. The district of Lower Montmartre became known as Black Montmartre. The sound that was becoming jazz was very popular with French audiences, but it took time for French composers to embrace it. By 1930, jazz became more mainstream, and French jazz composers and performers finally manifested.
So how would you purify water in case of a blackout? Oh, I'd boil it. Boiling kills bacteria, but it doesn't remove contaminants.
In Shuffle Along, Josephine Baker transformed a small part as a chorus girl into a starring role. Sissel provided her with special lessons and attempted to add more structure and professionalism to her performances. She complied with instructions during rehearsals, but broke into wild improvisations once in front of audiences. After Shuffle Along, Cecil Noble produced In Banville. White critics remarked that it angled too much to be high art and did not reach expectations of what whites perceived as Black comedy. To further appeal to white audiences, In Banville was renamed The Chocolate Dandies. When The Chocolate Dandies ended, several cast members moved to Harlem. The review Tan Town Topics hired Baker, and she performed at the Plantation Theater restaurant. Shows at the Plantation Theater restaurant attracted white theater goers and well-to-do blacks. African Americans who attended the show had to sit at the corner tables. Segregation was still the law of the land, even in Harlem during the Black Renaissance. In 1925, a wealthy American woman named Carolyn Dudley offered to take Baker to Paris with a troupe of black dancers and singers. Josephine said, quote, "I wanted to get far away from those who believed in cruelty, so then I went to France, a land of true freedom, democracy, equality, and fraternity." Josephine headed to France at age 19, and one of her main reasons for leaving was her hatred for racism in America. Baker realized that no matter how successful she became in America, she would still receive second-class citizenship. Josephine set sail on a steamship to Paris and later wrote, "When the Statue of Liberty disappeared over the horizon, I knew I was free." When the steamship docked at Le Havre, Josephine boarded a train to Paris, and people welcomed her with smiles, coffee, and croissants. From the train, Josephine boarded a bus for the Theatre des Champs-Élysées. Outside of the theater was Paul Collin, an up-and-coming artist commissioned to illustrate a poster advertising La Negra Revue. Collin had 24 hours to get the poster done, and while observing Josephine during rehearsals, he became impressed by her. Collin had an interpreter ask if she would come to his studio that night, where he convinced her to strip down while striking poses as he made numerous sketches of her. The poster featuring Josephine became famous. The director of the theater didn't like how the show was programmed, so he hired Jacques Charles. Charles wanted to feature Josephine more prominently. He also wanted to make the show closer to the idea of primal, exotic, and black eroticism. Charles created the Danse Sauvage for her to perform with Joe Alex. They both were to wear only skirts of feathers, like, quote, true African. Charles also wanted Josephine to appear topless, which was routine for dance hall performers and chorus girls. Charles's choreography was a projection of the stereotypes of African primitives, and his imagined dance was far from resembling African dance. Josephine was against appearing half naked and doing the, quote, primitive dance. Josephine's fears melted away on the show's opening night. She gave an incredible performance, and when it came time for the Danse Sauvage, she did a seductive, wildly rhythmic dance. Josephine later wrote, quote, "I was driven by dark forces I didn't recognize." At the end of the dance, the crowd leaped to their feet, applauding feverishly. Critics called her the African Eros and the Black Venus. Picasso referred to her as the Nefertiti of now. In one night, Josephine Baker became a Parisian superstar. Josephine began to receive lavish gifts and jewelry from fans. She lived in a 2-bedroom suite in the Hotel Fournet. Carolyn Dudley introduced Josephine to French designer Paul Perret, who transformed Josephine's wardrobe. Josephine and Paul Collin, the artist who designed her poster, began to have a romantic relationship, and he introduced her to Parisian socialites. By the end of 1926, she became the most photographed woman in the world. Josephine Baker dolls sold to thousands of fans, and her image became featured in advertising. Unexpectedly, white women held her up as a template for beauty, and she was a symbol of liberation. Josephine moved from Montmartre to an upscale neighborhood. She was celebrated, but still encountered racism. Josephine inspired white women to tan their skin to look more like her. Ironically, Josephine often rubbed herself with lemon juice and bathed in goat's milk and bleach to become lighter. In the 1930s, she started touring for a show named Les Joies de Paris, and by 1933, she was touring worldwide. In 1935, Josephine became booked to perform on Siegfried Follies. It made her the first Black woman to appear on the show, and she became the last. Sailing into New York, she remembered how she felt leaving all those years before. Her experiences in France grew her conviction tremendously, but she discovered America had not changed. She arrived in America and took a cab to the hotel where the manager checked her in and told her not to walk through the lobby again. In New York, she was still a second-class citizen. Josephine also experienced harsh racist criticism of her performance on Siegfried Follies. In addition, African Americans also criticized her, seeing her as too European. Josephine arrived back in Paris before her 30th birthday in 1936. She was active in the Red Cross and the French Resistance during World War II. She won two of France's highest military honors, the Croix de Guerre and the Legion of Honor. She partook alongside Martin Luther King in the March on Washington in 1963. Baker died on April 12, 1975, and received full military honors at her burial in Paris. The Harlem Renaissance was a unique time and place for African Americans. The movement helped to reinvent new ideas of Blackness in art, dance, and literature. It inspired thinkers, writers, and performers that still have an impact on us to this very day. We still debate the ideas of W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey. Artists like Haydn, Motley, Johnson still influence painters today. Dances made famous by Josephine Baker and Mabel Lee can be seen on TikTok today. Performers and songwriters like Cab Calloway still find relevance today. Writers like Langston Hughes inspired generations to become poets and embrace literature. I hope that in the near future, we can have another Black Renaissance like the one that happened in the Harlem Renaissance. I also hope that you'll subscribe to my channel and watch all my videos as well. I also wanted to give a big shout out to everybody that subscribed to my channel. Thank you so much. I'm going to switch up the content on my next one, so stay tuned. Until then, peace.
One of the most influential periods in Black American history.
Rainbow Room Publishing invites you to Homecoming, the virtual reading and Q&A event for From a Black Perspective, The Homeland. Sunday, February 23rd from 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. on RRP Live.